My name is Claire and I'm 34 years old. When I was 9 years old, I found a letter in my mother's dresser drawer that wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to my father, from a woman named Denise. I remember the smell of that drawer, old lavender sachets mixed with dust and the faint smell of my mother's perfume. I remember the sound of the ceiling fan clicking above me while I sat cross-legged on the floor, reading words a 9-year-old should never have to read. I remember the exact color of the carpet, a faded green, because I stared at it for a long time after I finished reading. My father left 3 months later, on a Tuesday, with 2 suitcases and no goodbye. My mother never talked about it. Not once. Not in 25 years. Even at holidays, even when I asked her directly at 16, she'd just change the subject and pour more coffee. For 20 years after that, I tried to be the kind of person who never got blindsided again. I checked. I confirmed. I asked twice. I read the fine print on everything, from apartment leases to birthday cards. Friends used to tease me about it. My sister Renee, 3 years older than me, called me the auditor because I always wanted receipts, literally and emotionally. I told myself it was just caution, just being responsible. It took me a long time, almost until my late 20s, to admit it was fear wearing a practical coat. Then, at 28, I met Marcus. He was 36, an electrician, hands always a little rough from work, voice always a little calm, the kind of calm that made rooms feel steadier just by him being in them. On our third date, at a small diner with cracked red booths, he told me his phone passcode without me asking, just slid the phone across the table and said, "In case you ever need to call someone for me." I didn't need to call anyone that night. That wasn't the point. The point was he offered something before I had to ask for it. Nobody had ever done that. That was new. And it landed somewhere deep in me. For 6 years, that small offer sat in my chest like a warm stone I carried around without even noticing the weight of it anymore. We built a life on ordinary Tuesdays. On him leaving coffee out for me before his early shifts, the mug always turned so the handle faced me. On both of us laughing at the same bad jokes, the kind only 2 people who've been together a long time still find funny. On Sunday drives with no destination, just to talk. I used to think, quietly, that I had finally outrun the house with the green carpet. We got married when I was 29. 2 years into the marriage, my mother-in-law, Deborah, started asking questions that felt more like inventory than curiosity. How much was in our joint account? Whether the house title was in both our names or just his. Whether Marcus had protected himself before the wedding, a phrase she used more than once, like it was a normal thing to ask your son's wife over Thanksgiving turkey. I told myself she was just old-fashioned, just protective of her only son. I told myself that for 2 years, even as the questions got sharper and closer together. 14 days before our 5th anniversary, Marcus changed the password on our shared home laptop. He'd never done that before in 6 years together. I didn't say anything right away. I just noticed, the way I notice most things now, quietly, filing it away. 2 days later, I found out he'd also changed the password on the joint banking app, the one we'd used together every single week to split bills, groceries, the mortgage. When I asked him about it over dinner, he said, "It's just for security, Claire. Nothing's wrong." His voice had a small crack in it, the kind you only hear if you've spent 6 years learning someone's voice the way I had learned his. At 5 a.m., 4 days before our anniversary, I woke up and he wasn't in bed. I found him in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, speaking low near the window. I only caught the end of it. "She can't find out until after the anniversary dinner. My mother wants it done clean." I stood in the doorway in my socks, the tile floor cold under my feet, and I didn't say a word. I went back to bed and I lay there until the sun came up through the blinds in thin gray stripes across the ceiling, thinking about another ceiling, another fan, 25 years ago, in another house with green carpet. Here is the part Marcus didn't know. 8 months earlier, before any of this started, before the passwords or the phone calls, I had quietly refinanced my share of our house using an inheritance from my grandmother, money that had come to me alone, before the marriage, kept separate the whole time on the advice of an estate lawyer I'd hired without telling anyone, not even Marcus. I hadn't done it because I suspected him of anything back then. I'd done it because 9-year-old Claire never fully stopped checking the locks, never fully stopped needing to know the exits were real. When I pulled the refinance paperwork out of my own file cabinet that week and looked at it again under the kitchen light, I realized something I hadn't let myself feel yet. I wasn't the one who was unprotected here. I never had been, not since I'd signed those papers 8 months earlier. That same week, my sister Renee called me, worried, saying she'd overheard Deborah on the phone with a lawyer of her own, talking about getting Marcus to file for something before Claire figures out what's happening. Renee's voice was shaking a little, which was rare for her. She begged me to just leave, to pack a bag that night and come stay with her and her husband. Part of me wanted to, badly. Part of me sat with the fear for a long time on the phone that night, the same fear that used to make me check twice, ask twice, keep receipts of everything since I was 9 years old. But I didn't run. I told Renee I needed one more day. I needed to see this through calmly, with facts, the way I'd never gotten to see my own parents' ending, which had only ever been silence and a green carpet and no explanation at all. Our 5th anniversary dinner was at Marcus's parents' house, a tradition Deborah insisted on every single year, no exceptions. 12 people around the long dining table that night. China plates that only came out twice a year, for Christmas and for this. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary drifting from the kitchen. Marcus's father, David, sat quiet at the head of the table like always, a man who mostly watched and rarely spoke. Renee sat across from me, her jaw tight, her eyes flicking toward me every few minutes like she was waiting for something to happen. Deborah stood to give her toast, glass raised, ice clinking softly against crystal, saying how proud she was of the family, how important it was, always, to protect what matters. Marcus stared at his plate. He wouldn't look at me. When the toast ended and glasses started to lower, I stood up too. My voice stayed even. No shaking, not even a flicker of it, though my hands were cold under the table a second earlier. Before we eat, I want to clear something up, since it seems to be on everyone's mind lately. The table went quiet. Forks stopped moving midair. Somewhere down the table, a chair creaked. The house isn't half mine because of some agreement Marcus can undo with a password change. It's mine because I refinanced my share 8 months ago, using my grandmother's inheritance, with my own name on the paperwork, filed with a lawyer of my own. I looked directly at Deborah. This is not a mistake. It has been mine for 2 years, since the original title transfer, long before any password ever got changed. Nobody spoke. Marcus's father set down his fork very slowly, the small clink of it against china the only sound in the room. Renee's hand found mine under the table and squeezed once, hard. Deborah's face went from confident to still, the kind of stillness that settles right before someone realizes they've already lost. She opened her mouth twice and closed it both times, no words coming out either time. Marcus finally looked up at me, and all he said, quietly, was, "Claire, I didn't want it to be like this." I believed that part, actually. I think some part of him never wanted to be the man on that 5 a.m. phone call. I think he was scared of his mother the same way I'd once been scared of an empty house at 9 years old. That didn't make it right. It just made it human, in the small, sad way that people become when fear runs their choices instead of love. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't cry, not there, not yet. I just said, "I think I'd like to go home now," and I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. In the weeks that followed, Marcus moved out of the house that was legally, factually, undeniably half mine, protected in a way nothing in my childhood ever had been. Deborah stopped calling entirely. Marcus's father, David, sent me one short text a few weeks later, "I'm sorry for my part in the silence." I didn't reply right away, but I didn't ignore it either. I kept the message, unanswered, sitting in my phone like a small, unfinished thought. I want to be honest about one more thing. I didn't try to take everything from Marcus, even though the paperwork gave me every right to walk away clean and whole. When things were finalized, I made sure he kept his tools, his truck, the small things that were only ever his and had nothing to do with any of this mess his mother had started. I didn't do it to look generous, and I didn't do it for him, really. I did it because I refused to become someone who used fear as a weapon, even against someone who had let fear be used against me. 3 months later, I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen, alone, coffee in hand, sun coming through the window the way it always had, warm and ordinary. Renee came by most Sundays now, sometimes with her kids, sometimes just her. We didn't talk about Marcus much anymore. We talked about ordinary things instead, work, her daughter's school play, a recipe she was trying that kept turning out too salty. Slowly, the house started to feel like mine again, not because a piece of paper said so, but because the quiet inside it finally felt peaceful instead of tense, the way a house should feel. Here's what I've learned, and I say this gently, to anyone listening who has ever sat at a table where the people who were supposed to protect you were quietly planning around you instead. You do not have to raise your voice to be believed. You do not have to fight loud to win. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm, stay factual, and let the truth do the work you were always too afraid to trust it with. Protecting yourself isn't the same as being cold, and planning ahead isn't the same as expecting the worst. It's allowed to be quiet. It's allowed to look like paperwork filed months before anyone ever raised their voice at all. If you've ever sat in a room full of people who were supposed to love you, watching them quietly decide your fate without you, I want you to know this: you are allowed to already have your own plan. You are allowed to have already protected yourself before anyone else even knew you needed to. You don't owe anyone an explanation for the ways you learned, early, to keep yourself safe. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it felt familiar, I'd love for you to subscribe. Every story on this channel is for someone who needed to hear it today, and if that was you, I'm glad you found this one.